was just commenting to Rita, I've seen this film, I think, three times, and each time what's most extraordinary to me was that, despite the title of the film, The Chinese Lives of Uli Sigg, what's really amazing was that when you watch this film, it's not just about Uli the man, the diplomat, the collector, but also in a sense, it's very much a kind of story of China in the second half of the 20th century. And you get a sense, especially towards the end, in the latter half, of how, art became part of this documentation of these rapid kind of historical changes happening. So I want to leave some time for, I think, Q&A. I think there should be lots of burning questions, but I just wanted to ask a few questions, and it's great that Orville is here because he's a China specialist. And, when I first saw this art back in Asia, in Singapore, in the 90s, actually, frankly, I was shocked because it seemed so new, so strange at that time, and so very different from the ink paintings and the calligraphy that I knew as Chinese art. And then on hindsight, I'm struck by the fact that even sitting in Asia and growing up in Asia, that sort of this type of cultural expression coming out from China, we didn't have access to it for a long time until much later, when it came out, and then suddenly it was this great profusion of these new things that we struggled to comprehend at that time in the early 90s. So I wanted to ask both Orville and Uli, of course, to say a little bit, and the film hints at it. It shows it in the archival images, but I think the narrative was quite discreet in that. But what was, following the end of the Cultural Revolution and the opening up of China, so to speak, of which, your role in bringing Schindler to China was quite extraordinary. I mean, what was the kind of larger climate, historically and socially for intellectuals, for artists, for people that, in a sense, were not farmers or were not, working in the factory? Was there an acknowledgement of that?
I talked such a lot. Shouldn't Orville start with this? And if I could ask one favor, could we tune down a little bit the light? It would make our life easier, and you'll have seen at least part
so we don't have to squint
of us.
so much.
Yeah, it's really blinding.
Uli, this film is wonderful. Let me ask you, I feel like seeing this and seeing knowing about your collection, of course, but it's a sort of a parallel universe, isn't it? This world of art that exists alongside this other world of politics, commerce, construction. What would your life have been like if you'd never run into these artists?
Most likely I would have focused more on literature, politics, business, and I would certainly know far less about China.
But what was it? I mean, in a sense, this was a time when there was no real sort of market for contemporary art production. So, how was it? You are one of the few that I know from that period. So how was it actually sustained on? What drove this extraordinary production? Who was collecting it? How was it being supported? Or it just wasn't supported at all?
For very long, only some Western people took an interest into this nascent scene of contemporary art, and Western people, professional people, some actually here, diplomats, etc., would see that art in addition to Chinese academics who also had access, and the very small art circles, but only a few Western people would actually purchase this art. And it took very long until even a handful of Chinese collectors appeared, maybe around very late 90s, 2000 only. So it was very much a phenomenon, at least when it comes to absorbing this art of Western people. The Chinese didn't have any purchasing power at the time. You imagine a Chinese apartment, where would there be a wall for a work?
Yeah.
There wasn't. So it has a lot of reasons why it happened that way. And of course, importantly, for a Chinese, it wouldn't give any status to own a contemporary work of art. The French would say, what the hell is this? And why don't you have a beautiful calligraphy there? So it just didn't appear in a broader public. And contemporary art, if you don't see it, how could you, understand it? If you don't understand it, how could you appreciate it? How would you ever collect it? It's a spiral for very long term downwards until then, it took a different direction after 2000.
So in the film, there are two sort of great historical markers. One is, of course, starting with the end of the Cultural Revolution, with the death of Mao. And second, of course, Tiananmen, which, those of us who study was also very important art. But, Orville, would like you to comment a little bit of, what was the cultural, looking back, what was the sort of cultural repercussions of, for example, when Tiananmen happened, in terms of not just art in particular, but in terms of generally culture in general?
Well, I think that decade when Uli, after you went in 79, the 1980s was an incredibly open period. And of course, nobody was collecting art, but people could do pretty much what they wanted to do if they could find the means to do it. And I think that was the period when we thought that China was going to reform both politically and economically. And as I think you pointed out in the film, Uli, 89 kind of ended that. And I want to sort of ask you whether you think, in many ways, that period in the 80s, art was pushing away from the past, using the Cultural Revolution, but trying to escape it at the same time. And now we find Chinese artists are kind of very interested in becoming just sort of artists, global artists. But to what sense do you think they are sort of bound to the Chinese experience for their energy, the tension in their art that's made it difficult today?
We, of course, see many artists, they are fascinated by this global mainstream art, and they want to be part of it. And they don't want to be seen as Chinese artists or invited to these big international venues because of their passport. So you have this group of artists, and the art they produce, wants to be part of this global mainstream art. And then you still have artists who sort of dig in their own resources, Chinese resources. And in fact, you have a strong turn over the last maybe 5 to 10 years of artists back to these roots, Chinese culture, dig into Chinese culture. Many have, after this fascination with Western art in the 80s, conceptual art found back and were sort of disillusioned by Western concepts and, saw that it doesn't provide all the answers. So there is a strong trend back to their own roots. So we see kind of these two streams merging somewhere out there in the world, and different people favor different currents. So it all coexists at the same time.
And how about you? Do you find yourself drawn to that art which sort of is derived from the Chinese experience, or do you find yourself equally comfortable with those artists who've sort of broken loose from that field of gravity that is uniquely China?
Well, the purpose of my collection has been to show what there is. So I try to record all of this, to mirror all of this without taking a position. Of course, now there is no more need to collect in an encyclopedic way after the donation. And given the fact that now there are lots of Chinese collectors out there, institutions out there who collect, so today I can cater more to my very personal taste. And yes, I'm very interested in whatever comes out of this dealing with the Chinese past, the Chinese culture. The global mainstream has less fascination for me, but of course I must study it in order to be able to evaluate what isn't.
Could you say a little bit more about that? Because you've spoken quite a lot about how your first phase of collecting, you were collecting, and in the absence of essentially a state public museum that was collecting comprehensively, work that document the changes in the art development, that as a result you were collecting works that was not actually to your personal taste, even some works in that period that you did not like personally, but you felt it was part of this mission. But how has that, now you say that that phase is over, and now because collecting is much more diverse, you are now in a position to make a choice of what you like. Could you say a little bit more? I think everybody is interested in what is this, what are some of the things that are guiding your choices now that the burden of encyclopedic collecting is you're no longer carrying that burden?
Well, some of that I have mentioned. It's then criteria we all would apply, looking at art, collecting art, or curating art. What makes good art? Does it surprise us? Does a work surprise us? We don't want to see in art what we already know.
Yeah.
Of course, we are all intelligent people. We think very logically. We can do that very often better than the artist. We want the artist to take us somewhere else.
It's a constant argument.
Then there are formal issues, like is the artist choosing the best possible form for a work. Sometimes that may be a painting, sometimes it may be a video work, and sometimes maybe the artist would much rather write a text, than have us face 2% of, the very rich, possibly very rich thinking. So that's another criteria I weigh heavily. And also, does it provide some kind of a sensual experience? Personally, I don't care about which medium. I'm open to everyone in the same way.
That's very rare, by the way.
We could go on much longer on this.
So before we open up to the audience, I just want to end with a question that we have been discussing the last few days, which I think we didn't get to, which is, if you were collecting, now we look back, oh wow, that was the heyday. But if you were a collector today and just starting out, and you made the decision, I'm interested in contemporary art from China, where would you start?
I think it's looking at a lot of art, wherever it is. It can be books, it can be exhibitions. That's still the best way to approach art, through all kinds of media. Read, talk, look at good art, look at bad art. Personally, I like bad art. And
could you say a bit more about that? Because
you like this
mentioned that
revolutionary
quite
romanticism and socialist realism. I mean, it has an incredible power, but you like it.
But that's not bad art. I like it.
Well, but
I like it.
Some people think it's not. Well, I don't know, not great art, but it's great art.
I think Uli was referring to. He made a big point, and in the press interview, that he also benefited from looking at a lot of bad art.
I think we all must do that, right? I mean, we have no choice but going through that. Wherever, also in China, be it in the past, be it now, you have to look at a lot of crap to find a meaningful work. It's like that. It's not only in art like that.
Yeah.
But the socialist realism, for me, was a very interesting art form, very passionate as long as it was authentic, as long as the people felt about it. And I met many of these artists who at the time painted these important works, and you could see they believed in it while they were doing it. Of course, at some point, and each individual life is different, you know, that kind of feeling faded away, and what came later may either look different or may not be authentic. And it's very interesting to see, hard to explain though, that very, very few of these artists who were important artists, painted important pieces, could make meaningful or significant art when it came to a new period.
Yes.
They somehow couldn't make this step, and many emigrated, many actually are in the States, in Canada. I met some of them here, and it's a very strange phenomenon. They just could not get into this new mode, and of course we see the same thing with artists maybe who sort of got stuck in the pop or in the cynical realism of the 80s. They learned their way, or taught themselves to create art against that kind of repressive system as it was. And once that kind of resistance disappeared, and their enemy sort of died away, they couldn't come to a new idea. But still, I think I have great respect for every artist who, in her life, his life, has one great idea. This is already an enormous achievement. Of course, now we expect the artist to invent himself every few years,
and
reinvent.
It's illuminating, because Ai Weiwei's comment about how really he feels the good Chinese art must be, in a sense, resisting authority. But I think the point is not that specifically, but that, something like what you said, that they created their greatest work in a particular kind of reaction to a particular kind of moment or a particular kind of authority. And once that moment passed, some transition and some sort of, don't make it as successfully. So I want to quickly open up to the audience some questions, because I know there were lots of hands. Can we just give you the microphone so that everyone, the gentleman in the middle and then in front, at the front.
Good evening, Uli, a terrific film. Listen, I have two questions, but in the interest of time, I'll ask the less contentious one. I'm interested in your relationship with Harold Saimin. I recall that in '97, I believe it was, he showed at the Biennale de Lyon a small selection of Chinese art, and then that was expanded 2 years later in his first edition at the Venice Biennial. Did you have any influence on him? Did he have any influence on you? How did that come about in terms of this, I think, very important period in terms of the West for Chinese art to be introduced?
I would say yes to every one of your questions. I first time heard about him after the Lyon Biennial, where he had shown a couple of works he had seen in a book, and he had also read a catalog of an artist where I wrote a short article. So all of a sudden I got a letter from him where he said, it's the first time I read something intelligent from a Swiss diplomat. And after this, I invited him to come to China. So he came to China, and I invited him to be a jury member of the Chinese Contemporary Art Award. As mentioned in the film, I was thinking, how could I bring the gatekeepers to the big Western events to China? And I thought maybe the best thing, do an art award, because it's very hard to imagine today, but at that time, nobody, except very few people, had the idea what the Chinese artists were doing. So I invited him into this first-time jury, and then he was very impressed by what he saw in the jury. And as a result, he then invited some 19 artists to the Venice Biennial 99. And for me, this is really the kickoff for a much bigger splash of Chinese art. Of course, Chinese art had been in the Biennial before, but nobody took note of it.
That was the moment.
Yeah, nobody. Yeah. And it was also the opening of the Arsenale, this huge big space. And the art professionals from all the world, who never would go to a Chinese exhibition, they just had to walk through this Arsenale. They just had to look at the Chinese art. That made a big difference.
There was a gentleman. I'm sorry, I cannot see. Hi, John. Come.
I'm waiting for the microphone. Thank you. Congratulations, Uli, on a very stimulating film. This is a question for Orville as well as you and all three of you. The film goes relatively light on politics. Could you say something about, in the different periods, the political restraints on artists, for example, compared to novelists, where there have been very obvious restraints on what one can publish in China? Artists seem to have had a greater degree of freedom, even going back to 1979. But what is the effect of politics on art in China today and in the past 3 or 4 decades?
Orville, would you want
Well,
to
I think, I think it's been, obviously politics has a profound effect, but I think the virtue of art is that it's indirect. Literature is a little less indirect, and music is even more indirect. So I think that allows the artist much greater latitude to express himself obliquely. And there is a grand tradition in Chinese sort of cultural history of allegory, of sort of indirect dealing with political questions indirectly, and that way they're more digestible. So I think we've seen different periods where the degrees of tightness have waxed and they've waned, but art does have that marvelously sort of flexible capacity to keep going in these sort of subtle and sometimes sort of underhanded, coy ways.
Not necessarily about China, but I can say a little bit about my experience from national funding guidelines. Generally, the extent of the dissemination of mass dissemination of the art form is a factor in how much attention you would give to really looking at the particularities of that form. So film, for example, which is considered very mass, newspapers, anything that appears in those tend to be much more closely managed. Visual art usually is seen, particularly when it comes to contemporary, is usually seen as much more niche. So it gets away sometimes with a little bit more latitude, and so the sort of equivalency is also in terms of what Orville said, something like music, which can be in a sense much more abstract, gets away with a lot more. In the performing arts, the most circumscribed form historically is always theatre, drama, live theatre. So in this context, visual art, especially contemporary art, tends to have a little bit more wiggle room across. And it's not just China, just in general, I think.
My impression was that the rules, though very vague, in theory the same, with one exception after the Fuck Off exhibition in Shanghai. Very vague, so they can be interpreted, at anyone's will. And I took in particular great care to find out what they are when I made the donation, in order to gauge what could be shown if the collection were in Beijing or Shanghai. And nobody was in a position to show me a real text, so little that I started to suspect it may not exist. But it was handled always with these vague texts and very broad laws, very well, differently at different times. There was a very short blip at very early 80s, relative freedom for artists. And at that time, well, much more was possible. Then came the campaign against the spiritual pollution. 82, 83 started it. And then, of course, everything was banned. But the visual arts, of course, has a much less of a multiplier than film or than literature. So it drew much less attention than the other disciplines. And then I found after 89, of course, everything very different. Nobody was staring enough for years to come forth. Maybe there was more activity in literature at that time and trying to reflect on this period than in the visual art. And then again, this Fuck Off exhibition, which showed some very drastic works, and before another exhibition, which also showed very drastic works. I mean, like corpses, like we saw one small image combination of human body and animal body, etc. When that show passed in Shanghai, also censored, but we have to keep in mind the censors are not knowledgeable people, to put it mildly, and they follow a list. They have this list which would say no living politician, Mao in no other but highly venerable attitude, no nudity, no intercourse, but everything else was okay. So at nudity I must exclude. So like in the exhibition there was a corpse of a nude woman in one space. The censorship passed it. It wasn't, could be ticked on the list, so you could see it. That led to very concrete legislation. After that cruelty and animal cruelty, etc., would be forbidden from then on. So it's the only time that I saw some legal activity. Everything else just practice.
And that was, for those who are unclear, that exhibition, the Fuck Off exhibition that Uli was mentioning, was a sort of independent event that occurred alongside the Shanghai Biennial. Right. And it was driven by people such as Ai Weiwei, for example. So one last question. There was a hand at the back. Where is it? Sorry, the lady.
First, I wanted to comment that after the last couple of decades looking at art in Manhattan, I saw more contemporary Chinese art in your film than I have around town for the last 20 years. So that was fantastic. And also, what I kind of observed that so much of it had to do with faces and figures, which this is not what I've seen around town. You still see landscapes and was what's in the film representative of what contemporary art is? A lot of figurative work.
Of course, the figurative work dominated Chinese art creation for very long. The whole education is based on figurative work. It comes from socialist realism and all this, and abstraction, say in the Western sense, can be debated, what's abstraction in the Chinese tradition. In the Western sense, also had no tradition. Actually was forbidden for the revolutionary period, as I think it was called imperialist formalism. So, everything was figurative. And I think what we saw in the film, though, is not necessarily very representative of Chinese art. It was actually what the artists had in the studios. And there's only a few works that are, for instance, in my collection, in our collection, or that are specifically filmed for this film. So it's not necessarily representative. In particular, there is much more other media. We saw mainly paintings here, with maybe the exception of Zafei's work, which is a big and complex piece in Second Life in a virtual world. So to me, the film could have more art. It's not my film, and I only saw it once it was finished. And that was my first impression. It doesn't show much Chinese art, but I'm happy you found some.
And of course, with the donation to M+, the collection will be available, for a long time, not just when the museum opens, but also, it's, there are traveling exhibitions coming up from there. So with that, I'd like to thank our Uli and Orville for being with us this evening, and all of you for coming to see this film. Thank you.